Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 15th of April 1923, the Blessings of Socialism. But first, the headlines. The big story this week was of a government defeat in the House of Commons. Don't ask me what it was all about. It was I will tell you, well, to some extent. It was to do with some sort of procedural motion. This sort of thing happens in the Commons. But the point was the government lost. There was even a fight afterwards, actually, in which, as they were filing out of the chamber, a Conservative struck a member of the Labour Party with his order paper. The Labour member turned round and threw a punch at someone else. Anyway, the point about that, these things all often sound really rather trivial because it's only a procedural matter, but it's a government defeat in the House. That's usually actually quite a big deal, and is usually it presages other things too. In the Irish Civil War, the Chief of Staff of the Republican Army, as the Times styles it, sometimes they call it the Regulars or the Rebels, he's been shot dead. And in Russia, they're going to start the trial of Patriarch Tikhon. Not content with having a go at the Roman Catholics, they're now having a go at the Orthodox Catholics. And, I've said and twice now, I realise, and this week saw the death of Lord Carnarvon. He was the man, well, part of the two-man team that discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun. In other news, in the United States, there is a court case concerning the future of the pyramid scheme and a part-time terrorist organisation, the Ku Klux Klan. The founder, one Mr. Simmons, I think he's suing the current leader, whose name escapes me. Well, yeah, that's about all there is to be said about that. On Tuesday, there was a article about the small number of suicides in England in comparison to those in the United States. Although it would perhaps be unwise to see this as evidence that the English are so much happier than Americans, because the American figures were all to do with cities, whereas the English figures were England-wide. Although on Wednesday, as if to prove that suicides are not unknown in England, there was the case of a plumber who had committed suicide. Not a particularly interesting case in itself, but except for this. The jury returned a verdict of suicide while temporarily insane. They always do that, which I do find odd even now. At the time, to commit or to attempt suicide was a criminal offence. So, well, obviously if you weren't successful, it was a criminal offence and you could be prosecuted for it. But every time someone commits suicide, a jury will say this. Why they do this? Is it because they don't want to admit people might commit suicide for entirely rational reasons? Is it because they don't want the disgrace or the families who feel the disgrace? I don't know. Funny. You may remember in the 1st of April episode, I mentioned the case of the singer Phyllis Lett, who had managed to get the composer Edward Elgar to help her. She was suing Pathé Frere Brothers for libel, because they put out some records that were made before she was famous. Now, the case has been settled, but what is interesting about this is that the terms of the settlement have been publicised, which I have to say is a good thing, and they reveal that Miss Lett, I presume it's a Miss Lett, has certainly got the better of it, shall we say. There's a big controversy in America because Congress passed a minimum wage act for women. And this has been struck down by the Supreme Court. And the basis of it is the Fifth Amendment. Now, even I have heard of the Fifth Amendment, and that, when people talk about pleading the Fifth, that's all to do with self-incrimination and not having to incriminate oneself. So how on earth this has been applied to the minimum wage, I do not know. I did look it up and I couldn't see it. I have seen articles elsewhere suggesting that it had been established that the Fifth Amendment meant that the state could not interfere with the law of contract. I find that a real stretch, and given that there has been a minimum wage in the US, subsequently it would appear that either that clause was struck down, or anyway, there has been some sort of Supreme Court changed its mind. On Friday, there was, just in brief, mentioned that on the Metropolitan Railway from Baker Street, they'd had a complete electrical failure during rush hour. Poor them. Just proof if you weren't aware of this, that even on private railways things can occasionally go wrong. There's also been quite some controversy in New York, because a New York senator or congressman or whatever has suggested that some New York policemen have been taking bribes to ignore the traffic in liquor. In case you'd forgotten, at the moment America is experiencing prohibition. Well, prohibition of mood-altering substances leading to corruption. Who would have thought it? In Bavaria, Hitler made a speech. It went as follows. Herr Hitler declared that the half-hearted attitude of the present and preceding governments would never succeed in creating a strong and prosperous Germany. Well, he's half right, except, of course, that a full-hearted attitude of a government that will appear in Germany also didn't do much for creating a strong and prosperous Germany. For that, Germans will have to wait until Ludwig Erhard gets into power. And if you don't know who Ludwig Erhard is, I would strongly suggest you look him up. Just to, as if to prove Hitler right, an article on the Mark suggested that something like 6 out of 7 marks is being printed at the moment. I mean, it is. I mean, this is devastating, but it's interesting that there have been very few reports. I can't remember a single report of the effects of hyperinflation in Germany, which is most certainly going on. A little bit of bad news for Hitler, though, came on Friday, when once again Einstein was proved right. Since he proposed his theory of relativity, don't ask me whether it's special or the general, I don't know. Astronomers, physicists have been eager to see if it's been proved right. Now, there was a test in 1919 which confirmed his theory. Another test has been carried out which again confirms it. So it looks like he's got it right. There has been a lively correspondence on the subject of the Abyssinian slave trade. On Thursday, there were a correspondent suggested that it was awful, to the extent that in the areas where slaving went on, there was essentially no one left. This was met with a response on Saturday, in which another correspondent suggested that actually there was no slaving going on at all, and that anyway you couldn't slave in Abyssinia, or Ethiopia as we know it now, because you'd have to take the slaves through Djibouti, or French Somaliland as it was known, and they would be stopped there. On Saturday, the Times reported on a case to do with Sunday trading, which was pretty much, well, not quite illegal at the time, but fairly difficult to do. What was interesting was not the ins and outs of the case, which was fairly complicated, but what the relative judges had to say. He, one of the magistrates, added that as a magistrate he knew that there was a great public feeling that these restrictions should not be unduly maintained or enforced. However, there were other judges who begged to differ. Mr. Justice Avery had this to say. In his view, this sort of legislation, which was intended to restrain the vicious propensities of those who indulged in the eating of sweetmeats up to bedtime, sweetmeats are sweets, must be maintained and enforced to keep such vicious tendencies in check. Well, that's telling them. For the record, Britain's rather odd Sunday trading rules did not get relaxed until I think it was the 1990s, and they're still a bit crazy, but that's the way it is. There's also been some controversy over state subsidy of housing. That is whether the state should subsidise houses with parlours or without. A parlour, from what I can work out, is what we would call a sitting room, drawing room, lounge. I think those are the three words we would use. But it illustrates the absurdity of when the state gets involved, because it has to specify everything clearly, and which means it gets into these sorts of knotty issues. It has to draw a line somewhere. There was also a story about the speed at which the Metropolitan Railway had expanded Wembley Park Station in preparation for the opening of Wembley Stadium, which is interesting given that, spoiler alert, things get a bit out of hand. Maybe they should have they should have spent their, maybe they should have done it a bit more. Maybe they should have done it a bit more slowly. Who knows? On Saturday the 14th, the Times published a letter from a P.E. Roberts of Worcester College, Oxford. Now, I did look up this chap, and the only thing I could find about him was that in the 30s he wrote a book on the British governance of India. Anyway, this has nothing to do with that. This is what he has to say. In his letter to the Times of April the 10th, Mr. Clifford Allen inveighs against the absurdity of a system which tolerates simultaneously a grave shortage of houses and thousands of unemployed builders, which economises rather than builds, and then spends millions a year on wasteful and demoralising doles to the unemployed. The system he describes is not, of course, as he seems to think, the capitalist system, but one which since 1914 was pressed upon the coalition government by the Labour and Socialist parties. I'm not quite sure what he means by the Socialist parties other than Labour. Socialist Party of Great Britain, perhaps? Indeed, from his point of view, Mr. Allen could hardly have selected to illustrate the blessings of socialism a more unfortunate instance than the present condition of the housing question. In the building trades we see socialistic principles adopted and developed to a greater extent than in any other. We find interference with economic laws both above and below. From above we see the state stepping in the supposed interests of the consumer, to intercept profits and to mulct landlords of their normal gain. Mulct means tax, I would guess. Below, we see unusually strong and well-organised trade unions, maintaining at their highest point the labour ideals of high nominal wages on an uneconomic basis, limitation of output, and the refusal to allow dilution at any cost. I think by dilution he means the use of non-unionised labour. He goes on. The result ought to be, on socialistic principles, something like an industrial millennium. But the actual result is the state of things so graphically portrayed by Mr. Allen himself. How often is this the case? How often is it that what is described as a failure of the market is in fact a failure of the state? I can speak about this with some authority. The reason being is that 20 years ago I wrote a pamphlet called Why British Rail Privatisation Has Failed. And again, is exactly the same reason. It wasn't competition, the free market that had failed. It was the state, because the state did and still does completely dominate the railway industry. Anyway, he goes on. If, on the other hand, we go back to pre-war times, to the unregenerate days of more or less free competition, we find a system which did indeed, like most human things, stop short of perfection, and which at any rate reveals to us an industrial world where landlords and builders enjoyed a fair measure of prosperity, where the workers earned wages at least equal in purchasing power to the inflated nominal wages of today, where periods of unemployment were spasmodic and temporary, where the building trades were able to absorb an increasing supply of new recruits, and where, above all, there was for the consumer a comparative abundance of houses available. It cannot be too often pointed out that since 1914 the capitalist system, in all its most essential features, has been gradually undermined. The economic world of today is certainly not one which capitalists would have fashioned or desiderated. I think that's how you pronounce it. Anyway, he goes on. A man who is happy enough to possess a fortune of £500,000 pays away in income tax and super tax something like half his income. That is to say, the use of one half of his capital is taken away from him in life. On his death, about 1/4 of his property is confiscated from his descendants forever. A system which has, rightly or wrongly, adopted these financial expedients, which has jettisoned all the ideals of the old economists, which has adopted the doctrines of state-regulated wages, excess profits dues, and corporation taxes, whatever else it is not a capitalist system. I like the idea of a world without corporation taxes. He goes on. We see, therefore, that Mr. Snowden's recent motion, this was the debate I talked about in the 25th of March episode, Mr. Snowden's recent motion on the failure of the capitalist system is the most magnificent piece of bluff ever attempted in politics. I take it that Mr. Snowden, for whose abilities I have every respect, was most deeply concerned with the calamitous failure of the expedients he has always defended. He became apprehensive that a motion might be moved, calling attention to the breakdown of state socialism. And then, as he meditated, the brilliant thought occurred to him that the best form of defence is attack, hence his famous motion. It should really, of course, have called attention to the failure of the declension from the capitalist system. In its actual form, in a world that is not given up to a slavish subservience to catchwords, and in a House of Commons with an elementary sense of humour, it only deserves to be incontinently laughed out of court. Hear, hear. But what might we do about it? On Thursday came a potential answer from Bulgaria. Miss Stambolisky, I believe he's the Bulgarian Prime Minister, said that a law would be brought before the new Sobranie, I guess that's the Bulgarian Parliament, providing for the confiscation of the property of communists in villages where the number of communists exceeds 10. The confiscated property will be given to the communes. This move is designed to arouse the peasants against the communists. And they can hardly complain, of course, because that property is going to the state, which is what they've always wanted. I wonder if we could do something similar with Islington. Anyway, that is all for this week. I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.